A father's past crime resurfaces when his daughter is kidnapped. Desperate for answers, he unleashes a storm of vengeance, but the truth is darker than he ever imagined. The story begins by showing a father named Paul, a successful businessman who is picking up his daughter from high school. It is revealed that Paul was a highly respected mafia boss in America before becoming a businessman. But now he has repented and chosen to make a living for his family legally. On the way home, Paul's daughter Caitlin asks permission to invite 2 male friends to the house tonight. Caitlin also tells him that one of them is a young man named Mike, who likes her very much. Hearing this, Paul allows Caitlin's 2 friends to visit the house on the condition that they behave politely. After taking Caitlin home, Paul went to a cafe to meet up with his 2 best friends, Kane and Francis. Once there, it is revealed that Kane and Francis used to be Paul's right-hand men when he was a mafia boss. However, they have followed in his footsteps since Paul decided to repent. At the cafe, Paul reveals his plan to rent the place to organize a birthday party for Caitlin. Kane, who turned out to be the cafe owner, was delighted and decided not to charge Paul any rent. Hearing the offer, Paul thanked him, and they continued their conversation. In the afternoon, Paul attended the opening of his business. He gave a speech and thanked the investors who had contributed. A few hours later, Paul asked his wife to accompany him to dinner, as some investors had invited them. While his wife was still getting ready, Paul went to the living room to meet Caitlin, who was already with 2 friends. Knowing that Mike liked Caitlin, Paul engaged him in a private conversation. During the conversation, Paul asked if Mike was involved in drugs or was a gang member, because if he was, he would not allow Mike to get close to Caitlin. Mike swore he was a good guy and had never dealt drugs. Paul was relieved and asked Mike to always look after Caitlin. Later, Paul and his wife went out for dinner. A few hours later, while they were eating, a police detective came and informed them that Caitlin had just been kidnapped by a group of criminals who were trying to rob their house. Hearing the news, Paul immediately returned home. When he got there, he saw the police inspecting the scene of the crime, while Mike and his friend looked battered. The detective then assumed that the group were not ordinary robbers, but intended to kidnap Caitlin. This was evident because no items in Paul's house were missing. Paul was confused and tried to figure out who would dare do this to him. The detective then suggested that this was most likely the work of Paul's old enemies, given his past as a former mafia boss. The detective asked Paul to remain calm as he and his team would do everything possible to find Caitlin and catch her kidnappers. After the detective leaves, Paul's wife continues to blame him. She assumes this incident happened because of Paul's past as a mobster. Feeling guilty, Paul finally decides to search for Caitlin and promises his wife that he will bring their daughter back no matter what. The next morning, Paul set out to find Caitlin. Before leaving, he told his wife to stay at home because some of the police detective's men would be on guard to protect her. As a first step, Paul visited Mike's house to ask about the characteristics of the kidnapper who took Caitlin. Unfortunately, Mike could not remember clearly because he was still shocked by last night's incident. After that, Paul meets his 2 best friends, Kane and Francis, and asks for their help finding Caitlin and catching the kidnapper. Kane and Francis agree to help, and they quickly strategize. A few hours later, Francis and Kane go to a mob leader named Andrew to ask who kidnapped Caitlin. The man tried to convince them that he did not know about the kidnapper, and insisted that only a fool would dare to challenge Paul. Even when the man was tortured, he insisted that he knew nothing about the kidnapping. The next day, a jogger accidentally found the body under the bridge and immediately reported it to the police. On the other hand, Francis and Kane tell Paul that they still haven't found any clues, even though they have met almost every mobster in town. As Paul is about to head home, the policeman assigned to watch over him informs him that his daughter has been found lifeless. Seeing his daughter lying stiff, Paul could not contain his sadness. During her daughter's funeral, Caitlin and Paul's colleagues were present, including an old friend of Paul's, a mob boss named Frank. After the funeral, Paul and Frank took the time to talk. Frank reminds Paul not to take action outside the law, given that Paul is now a good person and has a brilliant career. Frank also suggested that Paul entrust his daughter's case investigation to the police. Later, Paul gathers with Francis and Kane to discuss who might have killed his daughter. Kane suggested that Caitlin's death might be related to their sin 20 years ago, when they robbed and killed the brother of the head of the Russian mafia. However, Paul denies this, as there were no witnesses to their crime. On the other hand, the detective gets a report from his men that forensic tests show that Paul's daughter was shot with a Soviet gun, which has links to a Russian mafia family. This was the family whose younger brother had been killed by Paul and his two friends. The next day, Kane went to Paul's house to inform him of the forensic test results found by the police. It was discovered that his daughter had been shot dead with a gun often used by the Russian mafia. Knowing this, Paul was convinced that his daughter's murder was an act of revenge from the Russian mafia. Paul immediately invites Kane to pick up Francis, and the three go to one of the Soviet-owned bars. There, they slaughter the Soviets one by one until all of them are eliminated. Back home, Paul asked his wife to leave town until it was safe. She asked if it was all over, but Paul replied that it was just beginning. In the afternoon, after getting no response from the Soviet side, they planned to look for the former personal driver of the Soviet younger brother. Francis managed to get information about the driver's whereabouts. Then they headed straight to the location. Upon arrival, Paul asked his two friends to stay in the car while he went in to meet the driver, whose name was Danny. However, Danny, who was frightened, chose to run away. Seeing his target running away, Francis immediately shot him with a gun. Paul continued to chase Danny until he was finally cornered. At that moment, Paul revealed that he was the one who robbed and killed the Soviet brother 20 years ago. Hearing this, Danny says that as a result of Paul's actions, he now has to accept torture from the Soviets because they believe that he was the one who robbed and killed his brother. Paul then asked the driver if the Soviets were involved in his daughter's death. However, before the man could answer, he was shot dead by Francis. The next day, while Paul was at a coffee shop, a detective approached him and told him that his actions would not bring back his daughter's life. The detective also warned that if Paul and his two friends continued to be violent, he would not hesitate to arrest them. However, Paul seemed unconcerned by the threat. Later that night, Paul and his friends went to the Soviets' drug business. There, they again mercilessly attacked the Soviets' men, killing one of the most important people on the site. The next day, the police arrive at the site of the previous night's massacre. The detective had already suspected that this was the doing of Paul and his two colleagues. However, this time, the detective is thankful that the people who were slaughtered were wanted by the police. Meanwhile, the Soviet men report that some of their businesses have been destroyed by a group of people, and many of the men have died horribly. Hearing these reports, the Soviet boss, Chernov, was confused about why they would dare to disrupt his business. He ordered his men to arrest them. Later that afternoon, some of the Soviet men were seen coming to Kane's bar. Upon seeing them, Kane called Paul and told him the Soviet men had come to his bar. Paul, who heard the news, immediately tried to contact Francis. Unfortunately, Francis did not answer his call. Meanwhile, Kane tries to fight off the Soviet men, and ends up having to duel with one of the Soviets' right-hand men. However, Kane was unable to overcome them alone. Shortly after, Paul arrives at Kane's bar and sees the Soviet men loading Kane into the boot of a car. Paul immediately pursues them, and a chase ensues. Unfortunately, this attracted the attention of the police, who stopped Paul. The detective said that he would let Paul go because Paul had saved his life in the past. He was also grateful that Paul was fighting a police target, which meant that Paul's brutal actions were actually helping the police. Meanwhile, Kane continued to be tortured by the Soviets, who demanded an explanation of why Kane and his two friends had dared to interfere with their business. Kane chooses to remain silent, which makes the Soviets torture him even harder. Unable to bear the torture any longer, Kane finally reveals that all this happened because the Soviets killed Paul's daughter. Chernov looks confused as he never killed Paul's daughter and doesn't think he has any problems with him. Chernov further asked why they were accusing him. Kane replied that they had robbed and killed Chernov's younger brother 20 years ago, so they thought that Chernov wanted revenge. Hearing this confession, Chernov was furious because he had just found out that they were the perpetrators who had killed his younger brother. After that, Chernov ordered his men to contact Frank, the mafia boss who was Paul's best friend, because 20 years ago, they often worked together with Frank. On the other hand, Paul meets Francis, who turns out to be with a call girl. Paul is disappointed because when he needs Francis, he is having fun and not answering his calls. Francis explains that he needs time to relax after what they have been doing lately. Paul begins to suspect that Francis has betrayed him, especially since Francis shot Danny. In fact, Danny was one of their most important clues. Francis tried to deny Paul's accusations. However, Paul continued to press him until Francis finally got angry and hit Paul. Paul accidentally wounded Francis in the stomach, which killed Francis on the spot. Meanwhile, Frank and Chernov meet at a place. Chernov came with the body of Kane, who they had killed. Chernov explains that Paul, Francis, and Kane were the killers of his younger brother 20 years ago. Therefore, he holds Frank responsible, considering Frank was their business partner then. However, Frank felt that he was not involved in the murder of Chernov's brother, so he refused to take responsibility. Eventually, there was a shootout between them. In the evening, when Paul was about to go home, he recalled the events of the past when he killed Chernov's brother. He also remembered that he had taken Chernov's pistol, which he still kept in his house. Arriving home, Paul immediately checked the gun. He was shocked to realize that the gun appeared to have been used by someone, as it was stored upside down. Paul also realized that the bullets in the gun were the same as those found in his daughter's body. Finally, Paul concluded that the perpetrators who killed his daughter were none other than Caitlin's own friends, one of whom was Mike. Soon after, Paul arranged a meeting with Mike to lure him out. Paul asked Mike to tell him what really happened to Caitlin. Finally, Mike confessed. That night, the three of them were drunk. In that state, Mike and his friend were interested in Caitlin's story about her father, who was once known as a respected mafia boss. Caitlin also shows them Paul's belongings from his past, including a gun that belonged to Chernov's brother. They start playing with the gun until Mike accidentally shoots Caitlin. Panicked, Mike and his friend decide to dump Caitlin's body under a bridge. They also arranged for the incident to look like an attack and kidnapping by a mafia group. Mike, who felt so guilty and truly loved Caitlin, resigned himself to Paul. However, Paul realized that the incident was just an accident. Eventually, he decided to forgive Mike and leave him. Once home, Paul called his wife to tell her everything was over and apologized for letting her down. As it turns out, Paul did all this because he felt guilty for causing his two best friends to die. He saw it as a way to make amends for his past mistakes. In addition, he realized that as long as he was alive, his wife would never feel at ease, because Chernov's group would definitely continue to hunt him down.